Good afternoon, Ussama. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Bassam, how are you?
I'm good as can be, as you told me, as good as can be. We are very delighted to speak with you about our new series. What have we learned in the past almost a year? It's a series under the title Israel's Genocide 1 Year On, and we are going to start with. You're one of the couple of people that we're starting with, and we will go probably into October, if not beyond. And we are asking everyone 5 questions. We are hoping to get a shorter answer about what we have learned on various topics. And we have the topics that we discussed: Palestine, coexistence, Western values, universities, free speech, and then we'll end with where are we now or where might we be headed. Let's go to the first item, and this will be Palestine. It's a very big topic, and I will let you decide how to proceed.
So, what we've learned about Palestine, first of all, thank you, Bassam, but what we've learned about Palestine in the past several months with the genocide in Gaza is A, its centrality to questions of human rights, to questions of international law, to questions of morality, to questions of decency, to questions of making sense of the world and our place in the world. And the reality is that we're in the 21st century. We're recording in 2024. The genocide has been going on since 2023. And Palestine is the one issue that I'm aware of where almost everything that we teach and everything that we learn about human rights, about past injustices, about notions of good and evil, right and wrong. Palestine is the one issue where there is still, until this very moment, people who support the genocide, people who, of course, are enacting the genocide, people who support and enable the genocide, and there are so-called two sides to this issue. On no other issue that I'm aware of today in any respectable university or school are there teachers or professors who take the side of the racists of the 19th century, the slaveholders, the oppressors, the genociders in the past. But on Palestine, it's the one issue that's a real issue, that is a living issue. And so, in the sense, we can understand virtually all history, modern history, and 19th century history and 18th century history through the lens of Palestine, because we can see how it is that people in the past were able to say and do absolutely appalling things that we could not imagine. And yet here we are, right before our eyes. We've had the obliteration of tens of thousands of people, of every university in Gaza, of every school in Gaza. And people are either okay with it or support it. And of course, there are many people who are completely opposed to it. Many ethical people of all faiths, including many Jews, including many Christians, including many Muslims, who are completely appalled by what is happening in Gaza. And so Palestine gives us, in a sense, a key to making sense of not just the present, but also the past. It really gives us a window into worlds that we would not otherwise be able to make sense of. And so, in that sense, it gives us a window both into the imperatives of justice, but also to how people can justify the most obscene cruelties right before our eyes and do nothing about it. And so, it gives us a sense that there's nothing to be taken for granted, that we should never take for granted justice or equality or dignity or life, because all these things can be taken away and can be rationalized and taken away before our eyes. And so Palestine is a living issue that brings alive history, and that's what I work on, history.
Thank you. Let's move to the next topic, which is a related topic, and that is part of the most recent book of yours, Age of Coexistence: The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World, published in 2019 by University of California Press. You and I had a teach-in on the topic, except that you basically alluded to potentially the end of the age of coexistence, potentially. Can you tell us what we have learned in the past year about coexistence?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, the fact of the matter is that genocide is the opposite of coexistence. And That's the first thing to be said. I mean, coexistence itself as a concept, as a word, as an idea, as a history evokes this idea of people living side by side in many different conditions. And we spoke about this when we last met. The idea of coexistence, there can be coexistence without equality, there can be coexistence with equality, and there can be the negation of coexistence, i.e., expulsion or genocide. And so what we're witnessing today is, in fact, the antithesis of a long history of coexistence in the Middle East, especially in the Arab East, which historically brought together Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and many other peoples besides, in and under an extraordinarily long-standing Islamic empires, Islamic states. There wasn't equality until the 19th century, so we have to always, when we talk about coexistence, underscore the fact that it's not necessarily about equality. But in the modern period, what's interesting is that the Palestinians, who themselves are the inheritors of a multi-religious culture and civilization, in the sense that there are Muslim Palestinians, there are Christian Palestinians, there are Jewish Palestinians, and these people could have and should have coexisted were it not for the introduction into Palestine under British colonialism of the Zionist project, which was all about not coexistence with the Arab environment or the multi-religious Palestine, but the transformation of multi-religious Palestine into an exclusively Jewish state. And that, of course, entailed massive violence, both against the indigenous native Palestinian population, which was, as I said, multi-religious, but also violence against the entire culture of this region, which was based on the idea of transcending religious difference into commonality. Again, one doesn't romanticize the past, one shouldn't romanticize the past, but on the other hand, one shouldn't also deny the past and its relationship and implications for where we are today. Zionism as a political project emerged in Europe in response to European problems, European anti-Semitism, and sought a European solution, that is to say colonialism and colonization of Palestine, through and with the help and the aid of the British Empire. Hence, Zionism became a colonial project in Palestine that methodically worked to transform a multi-religious land and space into an area of a sovereign, exclusively Jewish state in which Palestinians, the natives in other words, would inevitably either be expelled, which is what happened to most of them in 1948, or would be second-class citizens, perpetually subordinate to a state that does not recognize them as an essential element of their national sort of being. And so that's what coexistence and the last 11 months of genocide teaches us, that coexistence cannot be taken for granted. And ethnic cleansing and colonialism are the antithesis of any kind of coexistence that we today would want to cherish.
A quick follow up, Osama. There is a talking point about the treatment of Jews in the broader Arab world, primarily the Mashriq, and within Palestine, prior to the emergence of Zionism, and sometimes, not sometimes, actually, specifically after the emergence of Zionism, which is used as an example of the problematic conditions under which Jews lived with Christians and Muslims in these areas. And of course, we know that without the advent of colonial Zionism, this would not have been the case, with the caveat that we don't want to basically idealize any forms of coexistence anywhere in the world. Can you address
So
that?
what? Yeah, sure. So what I'd say to that is a couple of things very briefly. One, I would say I agree with you 100%, and we've said this many times. We shouldn't idealize any form of coexistence. So go study the histories, go do the work, and see the complexity especially in pre-modern and early modern, as well as in modern forms of coexistence. Never take coexistence for granted, and never assume it means equality. That's the first point. But on this point that you're talking about, in other words, these talking points that Zionists often bring to the table, which is what happened usually, that they counter they used to deny the Nakba. Now they no longer deny the Nakba as much as they say, well, Jews were expelled from the Arab world as well, therefore it all equals or cancels each other out. And of course the response to that is twofold. One is to insist yet again and always that anti-Semitism in its modern racialized form emerged in Europe. It was a European Western problem. It affected, of course, and was directed at European Jews, which is why Zionism emerged in Europe in response to European problems, Zionism and nationalism. And because it was European, and because the Zionists were all European, or overwhelmingly European, the leaders, I mean, they ended up sort of adopting European solutions, i.e., colonization. And their view of the Palestinians and the Arabs, as well as of Eastern Jews, was an extraordinarily prejudicial, and I would even say racist view, a 19th century view, because that's the way people in the West typically thought at the time of non-Westerners. So anti-Semitism did not emerge in its modern form in the Middle East. And Zionism did not emerge in the Middle East. So that is an essential aspect to understanding this history. Then the reality is, because it did not emerge in the Middle East, it had to colonize Palestine. And yet it was anachronistic in the sense that it was imposed on Palestine, Zionism that is, with British colonial support, after the age of self-determination had arisen. And so there was a huge opposition because it was so flagrantly out of time. It was so flagrantly anachronistic, this idea of coming in, taking someone else's land. And it sort of generated huge opposition. Opposition that initially tried to separate and distinguish between Jews and Zionists. But of course, the Zionist movement itself never distinguished between Jews and Zionists, because the whole axiom of the Zionist movement is that one can't be Jewish and Arab. You have to be either Jewish or Arab. Whereas the Palestinians in Palestine, historically, you could be a Palestinian Muslim, you could be a Palestinian Christian, you could be a Palestinian Jew. And in theory, had it not been for colonial Zionism, in principle, just like in Lebanon, like in Syria, you could have easily emerged with a Palestinian citizenship where you could be Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, as was the case in Lebanon, as was the case in Syria. That didn't happen in Palestine. And of course, there was, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And in reaction, one has to be honest, there was terrible things that happened to Jews in various places in the Middle East. But that doesn't excuse the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. One has to understand that these are two sides of the same problem: the imposition of colonial Zionism and the reactions to colonial Zionism. But under no circumstances can one use the suffering of Jews in the Middle East to excuse the suffering of Palestinians. That's what I would say. And the other thing I would say, just in a broader point, is historically speaking, again, it's important to emphasize this, Jews were not singled out as the exceptional minority in the 19th century Middle East. It's simply not the case. There's nothing analogous to the anti-Semitism of Europe. If anything, the great problem that haunted the Ottoman Empire was the question of the Christian minorities, and specifically the Armenians, which is why there was something called there were the massacres of the Armenians in the 1890s, and then the genocide during the First World War. So I think it's really important to emphasize this point, that don't allow people to take talking points to distract from the suffering of the Palestinians, or even worse, to pit Arab Jews against Arab Palestinians. I think that is a huge mistake. And I think that's exactly the opposite of what we should learn. We should actually historicize both the experience of the Palestinians and the experience of Jews in places like Iraq.
Next, I'd like to go to a can of worms, not least because the actual terms that are used are a bit murky, and you being a historian would probably, unpack this phrase or these terms. What have we learned in the last year or so of Israel's genocide about Western values? And I put all of these in quotation marks.
Well, first of all, that they have to be in quotation marks. There's no such thing as Western values that are absolute, that are unchanging, and that are uncontested. What we see in the West, as we see everywhere else in the world, but in particular the West, is a huge struggle over the meaning of these so-called values. In other words, there are many, many young people who are extraordinarily supportive of Palestinian rights and Palestinian justice, and there are many people who are completely flippant and opposed to Palestinian justice and freedom. So that's what we see, there's no such thing as West or Western values. There is a constant um, contestation over the question of who defines what values are and who's included in the space of values.
Now, despite the murkiness and the constructed nature of this phrase or these terms, Western values, they do refer, at least by those who speak of Western values as representing them. There's this pretense of a distinction between Western values and the rest. Regarding that pretense, what happened to this pretense in the last 12 months or 11 months or so?
Well, two things have happened. One is that this pretense has been exposed as a pretense and as a cover for obscene and scandalous injustice, oppression, obliteration of humanity. We're talking about the destruction of schools, hospitals, tens of thousands of children, the introduction of polio epidemics. I mean, it's what's going on in Gaza is just an absolute and utter scandal. And anyone who says otherwise is on the wrong side of anything called human values. Honestly, if that's what I would say. On the one hand, it's exposed the pretense of those who speak on behalf of Western values, and on the other hand, it also exposes the fact that those who speak about Western values and talk about human rights and talk about Western civilization as liberalism and as freedom and as democracy and all that stuff, do so by ignoring the fact that on the ground in Palestine, and this circles back to what we were saying earlier, on the ground in Palestine, there's proof of the opposite. That that what is going on is unconscionable. It is a complete negation of these professed values. And the reality is that in the West, there are many people, students of all faiths, professors, educators, lay people who are appalled by what is going on in Gaza. And these could be secular people, these could be atheists, these could be religious people, pious people, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc. And they're appalled. And that tells us that values ultimately are human values, or else they're not worth talking about as values. As soon as you start talking about Western values and separating them from Eastern values or whatever you want to say, you start orientalizing and dividing up the world, you lose sight of what we should all be cherishing, which is universal values, irrespective of whether one is Western or Eastern or Northern or Southern or whatever.
For many years, especially for those of us who have been, around since the 80s and 90s and 2000s, for many years, we speak in the United States specifically, but I'm assuming this could actually apply to some European countries. We have talked about the university being the last bastion of freedom, or in some sense, the last bastion of something that has not been completely overtaken by neoliberalism or what have you. I mean, we sort of distinguish universities. And I have followed your work. I've followed your commentary, including on social media, and you have a lot to say about universities. That's quite insightful. Can you tell us, in the past almost a year, what have we learned about universities, and particularly the universities you're familiar with? I'm assuming mostly in the United States.
At least two things that I've learned in the past 11 months of genocide. First of all, on the positive side, there have been an extraordinary array of students and faculty and even staff who, if they were allowed to speak, would speak even louder, who have been absolutely appalled by the genocide and by the censorship and by the denialism and the racism that's been directed at students of all faiths, but especially at Palestinian and allied students who are protesting against the genocide. So universities have and have always been a space where people who think and think critically are able to articulate a certain kind of vision of the world that lives up to the ideals of values and education that we all cherish, which is why it's at universities typically that we see students who take the lead in protesting in the past against the Vietnam War, for civil rights, against slavery, and so on and so forth. It's always been the case. And at the same time, and by the way, it's not just universities; it's also high schools. I've seen high schools demonstrating and marching. I've seen middle school kids marching and demonstrating and protesting and speaking out about Palestine. So there's something quite beautiful about education in that sense, in the sense of awakening what is best in our students and in our common and shared humanity. On the other hand, what we also see, of course, is that universities, especially in America, are increasingly a shell of what they used to be in the 1950s and 1960s. In other words, universities are in fact incredibly weak in certain ways. They depend enormously on donor funds. They depend enormously on the consent of the elite. They depend enormously on not actually encouraging too much critical thought, because that may get them into kinds of trouble. And they're always fending off, and they depend, of course, on the US government, on the, whether it's the military industrial complex, whether it's the technological or medical, whatever it is. There's a lot of there's a lot of compromises that universities have to make to survive. It would be sort of wildly naive to pretend that the university is still the sacred space where one can think unfettered. Yet at the same time, paradoxically, despite the siege on free thought and critical thought that we see across this country, universities still, despite all this, at least some universities, still have spaces, certain spaces, that are able to articulate, or in which and from which students and professors and staff are able to articulate visions that don't settle well with, or don't sit well with, those who are in power and those who support injustice and those who turn a blind eye to the extraordinary evil of what is going on in Gaza. In other words, the genocide and the obliteration of Palestinian humanity and education and society and mosques and churches in Gaza. It's absolutely, and children, it's obscene. So in that sense, universities and schools, are spaces of contestation. That's what I've learned. Don't take education for granted. There is a moment and a time when all this can disappear. Even the small space that universities and schools offer our students can be crushed and broken up. That's what I have learned. It's not to be taken for granted. Maybe not going to be obliterated in the way that Gaza education and universities and schools have been obliterated by American-made and Israeli-dropped bombs, but nevertheless pressured. And we see that even now, Hassan, we see what's happening now with the pressure that's being put on students and faculty and staff to stay silent on this question. So I think universities are spaces of contestation. That's what I've learned.
The next question relates to this one, and it's about free speech and or academic freedom. In the past year or so, what can we say about free speech and academic freedom in the United States in particular?
Again, do not take these for granted. They are always under threat. And the discourse of academic freedom means nothing if it's not accompanied by dissent in actual universities and schools and society at large. And so what I've learned in the past 11 months is that there's a convergence, and we see this happening before our eyes. And those who are in high schools and middle schools know this even better than university professors. There is a convergence between a right-wing, xenophobic, so-called anti-diversity, I would say anti-black, I would say anti-immigrant, racist, xenophobic discourse. There's that right wing who can't stand critical dissenting thought and don't want our students to learn about the complexity of US history or the negative sides of US history. And at the same time, there's a convergence of that stream, which has its own constituency and its own sort of people who are pushing for it, and of course its own politicians in the US Congress. That stream is converging with, I would say, a liberal Zionist stream that's not necessarily xenophobic and is not necessarily anti-immigrant by any stretch of the imagination, but is certainly not comfortable and in fact deeply opposed to meaningful Palestinian liberation on the ground. And has been, I would say, complicit with the genocide insofar as they haven't come out and made a stand against not just the genocide, but also the structures that have moved us to genocide. In other words, the whole idea of creating an exclusive ethno-religious nationalist state on someone else's land. That's the real sort of source of all the terrible events in Palestine, is the fact that there's a history of 100 years which is absolutely obvious, and anyone can go read about this and educate themselves about this. And the facts honestly do speak for themselves, which is precisely why there is so much censorship, so much denial about the history, because the history is so crystal clear. The vast majority of people, when they are exposed to this history of their own, will realize very quickly what is absolutely appalling in this history and what is beautiful in this history.
We have had a number of teach-ins on the attack and targeting of universities, of higher education by right-wing groups since the 1990s, because they viewed them as a liberal, a bastion of liberalism and so on. And you addressed now that effect of this group. Now, in addition to the influences by liberal Zionism and various strands of Zionism, are we seeing some sort of a perfect storm that has made a true exception out of dissenting views on Palestine, or those who are speaking on behalf of Palestinian freedom and equality in reference to Palestine? Because without that sort of combination, for instance, the critical race theory, the attacks on critical race theory from the right have actually been opposed by a good deal of groups and networks and institutions at the university. But we are, of course, now seeing something different. Is this what explains it, this combination, or is this what is the shape of things to come in general?
Well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what's going to come, but the convergence is certainly playing out before our eyes. There's no question about that, because the whole point of places like Barnard and places like University of California, places that are, in other words, are in democratic states run by liberal, you would say liberal or neoliberal sort of economic and political and social sort of systems. These places are not run by Republicans. They're not run by people like Trump and so on and so forth. These are allegedly liberal. They're liberal on many issues, from climate change to all sorts of other issues. But on Palestine, as you can see with Barnard, which today or yesterday or whatever it was, they just came out with these absurd regulations saying that you're not allowed, staff members and faculty are not allowed to post or put on their doors issues that talk about that take a geopolitical position on or take a position on a geopolitical issue without giving both sides of issues. It's honestly absurd. It's the antithesis of ethical education and making distinctions between right and wrong, between X and Y. I mean, that is the essence of education. We teach our students to think critically, not to say that everything is the same or everything has two sides, because obviously things have vastly more than two sides to begin with. And second of all, not every side is the same as every other side. Otherwise, our education would be meaningless. And so, yes, the convergence of the right-wing attack on critical race theory, for example, would only go so far if there's staunch opposition. Yet on this issue of Palestine, what you see is a convergence between these right-wing attacks and liberal Zionist attacks. And the interesting thing is that both, and especially the liberal Zionists, and these are the ones that we deal with because they're more, I would say, they're more liberal in a sense. They understand that there's a fundamental problem in their sort of ideology. And so, in other words, in the sense of advocating for Israel as it now exists is very difficult. It's very difficult to justify a genocide. It's very difficult to pretend that the genocide is not taking place. It is very difficult to make an ethical or an historical argument about the history of modern Palestine, for example, that doesn't centrally acknowledge the experience of the Palestinians as the indigenous population. In other words, the Zionists have lost the ethical, moral, and intellectual battle. They've lost it, and they know it. And that's why they're trying to censor our students and our faculty and our staff and our students and our high school teachers from teaching about Palestine, because they don't actually have an argument to make that's positive. It's all a negative argument. Don't teach about Palestine. Don't do this, which is parallels, and it's not the same, but it parallels what the right wing says about American history. Don't learn about X and Y. Don't learn about slavery. Don't learn about Jim Crow. Don't learn about this. Don't learn about that. Learn only about the glorious aspects of American history as we would like to imagine it. In other words, it's an America of fantasy as opposed to the America of history, and it's a Zionism of fantasy as opposed to the Zionism on the ground in Palestine as it has been experienced by Palestinians, who are the indigenous population. That, I think, is what I've learned. This convergence is extremely worrying, and time will tell if there are enough people in American institutions of all faiths. Again, because remember, this is not about being Jewish or Muslim or Christian or atheist or whatever. It's about being a person of conscience who can see what is that is being posed to us as people who care about not just Palestinian life, but all life, honestly. And that's where we are right now.
Very quick note. I don't know anyone, almost, I mean, I can't even think of anyone, maybe I am not aware, that is or that was afraid in a university setting of pushing back against critiques of critical race theory, critiques that actually call for the removal of such material and so on. But I know more than I'd like to know people who are afraid to push back against, for instance, critiques um, that involve anything that has to do with Palestine and Israel, because there's a price to either supporting Palestinian rights or supporting critiques of Israel or defending Palestinians and so on, which is a big difference between the two. And I wonder whether that, in and of itself, if one thinks about its implications, whether that means that there are a lot of people around us that are actually critical of what's happening in Gaza, but we don't know that they exist, and we're not aware of the magnitude of the opposition to what's happening, save the halls of power. Is this potentially a good thing in the future, or is this not relevant in your view? Very quick, Yani.
Well, I think, first of all, I think that it depends where you are in terms of CRT. In other words, if you're in Florida and if you're in Texas and other places, where there's a campaign, an overt campaign against CRT, one can, of course, be in a lot of danger, and
True.
one can. I'm sure there are a lot of people who would like to say more things and don't. But I agree with your fundamental point. There are a lot of people who are afraid, who know better about Palestine, but are afraid to say anything because, of course, there is a price to pay. We see what's happened to students who've been doxxed, to professors who've been vilified, to staff members who, whether they're nurses or others in schools who've lost their jobs. And so but that's precisely what makes this issue of Palestine a general, universal human question. It's precisely because there are people who are out there who are absolutely opposed and terrified of you speaking out, which makes speaking out all the more important because there are consequences. This is not like talking about something that's done and dusted. This is happening right now, and our voices can make a difference.
Thank you, Osama. We will ask you the parting question, and it's basically open to however you'd like to approach it. And that is, where are we right now, and where might we be headed in terms of the question of Palestine? Or
We're
what
11
is
months.
happening in terms of the genocide?
Yeah, we're 11 months into a genocide. None of us, at least not me, I never expected it to last this long. I've been absolutely appalled. Like you, Bassam, and like so many others that I know, you wake up every day, you go to sleep every day, looking and obsessing to see what's happened, what's the latest sort of catastrophe. And the reality is that we've gotten to a point where people seem to be okay. Not everyone, again, it's important to underscore this, not everybody, but many people are okay with the idea that Israel can slaughter 60 people or 50 people or 40 people in a day. We're talking about civilians and children. It's unacceptable. And so where we are right now is at a critical crossroads, both for education, both for freedom, both for the very idea of what it means to be human, and for our collective future. Because if this continues this way, then the lesson to the rest of the world is you can do whatever you want overtly in front of everyone, and nobody's going to stop you. And that surely is not a lesson that we want to teach people.
Thank you so much, Usama.